Welcome to part 3 of our fall sermon series, Reset, where we're taking a look at the lives we lead and the rhythms we desperately need. This week, we're talking about crowds, a word and a topic that likely just made all you introverts squirm a little bit. Because in case you didn't know, I'm very extroverted and I love a good crowd. When I was a kid, just about every summer, our family would go to the Minnesota State Fair. It's affectionately known as the Great Minnesota Get-Together. And I loved it. I absolutely looked forward to this every summer. It was a day filled with 100,000 of my closest friends. At least that's how I felt about it. The day was filled with food and games and sights and people getting their likeness carved into a block of butter. Welcome to the Midwest. The day was also filled with people everywhere, at all times, people walking into you, in front of you, most of them unaware of personal space. And it didn't bother me so much, but it did bother my dad. Because my dad does not like crowds at all. My dad he's like the first introvert I ever knew, before I ever knew what that word was. He does not like crowds. They exhaust him. He avoids them very well, but for some reason, we would always find ourselves at the state fair. It's like he mustered up all of the extroversion for the entire year and put it into this one day as a family to go be around all of these people. And by the end of the day, he was just done, right? And I can't imagine, as a father now, I can't imagine what it was like for him when I was really young. Because if crowds already stress you out, then the struggle of keeping track of a small, wandering child would make you crazy. Well, those same crowds that filled me with energy and excitement absolutely drained my dad. And by the end of the day, he was probably going right home, right to bed. But that's me. I love big, crowded places like that. And believe it or not, I also enjoy quiet spaces and places. I'm okay with silence and solitude. But if I'm honest, when I'm looking for some downtime or some good workspace areas, I often find myself in busy places. I love working in a place like a coffee shop because I like the low-level hum of the white noise of a busy place. I also like being surrounded by people, and I love it when I run into somebody I know. I also love the opportunity to make a new friend. Basically, I'm just like a golden retriever puppy at heart. But I think for me also, I like feeling like I belong somewhere. I like feeling part of something bigger. And being in a place where I feel like I'm known. I feel like I belong. At the same time, crowds and busy places can sometimes create a false sense of belonging and community. If nothing else, they're temporary. For sure, all of us gathered in the coffee shop together at any given time. We're all here together, but we're not really here together. We're all in our own heads. We're in our own conversations, in our own thoughts, we're on our own screens, in our own books, maybe occasionally glancing up at the world around us or having a nice side conversation with our neighbor or whatever it may be. But we can be in these big, busy places, but still feel so alone and isolated. And just because we are surrounded by people does not automatically mean we belong or feel like we belong. If you've ever been to a concert or a sporting event, it does raise the connection level a little bit. Right? All these people gathered in this space for the same reason, for the same band or artist or the same team. And there's a sense of belonging because we've all come for the same reason. Like we're gathered in support of our favorite band or artist or team, and we wear the colors, and we sing in unison, and we cheer together, and we root against the other team, and like all these things connect us. Yet, like when the concert's over and the game ends, like that's it, right? We all just go home, and the connection, as good as it was, is over. And then, frankly, once we're all trying to leave our parking spaces and getting in each other's way, we're all instantly upset with each other. And like all the connection we had, like what happened? It's totally gone. But crowds they're just magnetic, right? Like there is something, I mean, it's just us, right? It's just people. We're just people together. But there is this unique quality to crowds that have a certain gravitas and energy. It can pull us in, and it can easily push us out. It's just something that we feel and experience in crowds. Crowds are like these organisms we create, for better or for worse. And in cases of the latter, we find ourselves sometimes in the middle of a not so friendly crowd. We could for sure come up with some really good examples of how we've seen this happen or maybe experienced it ourselves. Like that moment when a crowd all of a sudden becomes a frenzy or a mob. These kinds of crowds, unfortunately, are everywhere, just more subtly. If you have any kind of social media account, I think you know what I'm talking about. We can click our way onto pages and all of a sudden getting these algorithms that send us down dark roads and lead us to more places of hate or false information or just frenzied voices offering no hope. Like no helpful solution, but instead filled with cranky quips and soapboxes and opinions, and there's really like no dialogue or discourse. And if there is, it's often not helpful. It's definitely not healthy. And soon this becomes our entire feed, right? Like this is what we scroll through at any given moment. It's what keeps getting fed to us. And if we're honest, most of us are looking at this sort of stuff before we go to bed at night. And so we go into these unhealthy and unhelpful, crowded places of people screaming and yelling on the internet or wherever, and then we're just like supposed to be okay or get a good night's rest. And we're going to get more into the distraction of technology in a few weeks, so I won't say much more to it here, but this is one of the ways that we find ourselves in crowded places, and we become so easily exhausted and distracted by them. We've been looking at our foundational verse here as a church, and it's the verse that greets you on our homepage. And if you've been following us, like you probably know it by now, but it's Jesus' words from Matthew 11, 28 through 30. And the Message version reads it like this. Jesus asks, are you tired? Are you just worn out? Are you burnt out on religion? Well, come to me and get away with me, and you'll actually recover your life. Like, I'll show you how to take a real rest, and I want to invite you to walk with me and work with me and watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. And I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. I want you to keep company with me, and you'll actually learn to live freely and lightly. Well, in part 2 of this sermon series, we talked about the distraction of noise, and we looked at Jesus' regular rhythm of restorative silence and solitude. And as we're talking about crowds this week, we can also find several examples throughout Jesus' life where he reached his capacity for crowds too. Right? There are countless times where Jesus just runs out of energy and needs to get away, to leave the crowd, to push back, to decompress, to rest and to recover. We've also spent some time in Luke 8 these past weeks. Last week we recalled the story of when Jesus calmed the storm in verses 22 through 25. And we're going to stay in this chapter for this week and for the next because there's just so much here. So again, a real quick backdrop. Jesus has been traveling around on this teaching circuit with the disciples, and everywhere he goes, there's this crowd waiting to hear from him. Like, there's so many people that are just hungry for hope, right? Hungry to learn and to be taught. And everywhere they go, the crowd follows, and the crowd just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So halfway through Luke 8, Jesus just calls it. Like, we need a break. And he calls his disciples over, and he's like, let's get in the boat, let's push out into the sea, and let's go across to the other side. In very much need of rest. And as the story goes, after being out at sea for a while, the storm swells and the boat almost capsizes. And Jesus, who had been sleeping in the bottom of the boat, they wake him up, and he comes up to the water, and he, with his words, he's like, waves, be still. And he calms the storm, which is a whole wild story. But then they end up on the other side of the lake, safe and sound, and like, and as soon as they step foot on the shore, they are met by this severely troubled man. A man who is possessed with a host of demons. A legion, the text tells us, which is actually a military term that signifies anywhere from 2,000 to 6,000 people. So this man is living in a graveyard, away from society. He's naked because in his deeply troubled state, he's torn the clothes from his body. And the only thing he wears are the broken chains that are still attached to his wrists and his feet. And his body, his precious body, suffers both old scars and new wounds from self-inflicted harm. This man is a lot to look at. It's hard to see the state he's in. It's hard to know what to do with that. For the community, it's been too hard to know what to do with him, so they've pushed him out to the tombs, outside of society, where he's become a broken recluse, clearly an outsider nobody wants to deal with. And this is just worth our attention. The Greek word used here for him for unclean is akatharto, or akathartic. The opposite is cathartic, right? And cathartic is defined as providing psychological relief through the open expression of strong emotions, like a cleansing, necessary release of what's going on inside you. If you've ever had a good, deep, hard cry, you know what I'm talking about. Where you can just release the weight that's been held inside of you. It's so good, but this man cannot do that. He cannot be released from the weight. He doesn't have agency to do so. The weight of these tormenting feelings and thoughts and voices are held in his body, and they won't come out. They only come out in the voices of these demons, and he's trapped in his own turmoil. This man is in chains, naked and exposed, hungry, sleepless, and living in the caves of the dead and cutting himself. This man is an image of incredible pain. It's also an image of the community and its answer, or lack thereof, for those struggling the most. This man's pain is physical and emotional and mental and spiritual. And Jesus goes to work to save this man from his torment. Very quickly, this is what happens. Jesus asks the man his name. And the man doesn't respond, but the demons do on his behalf, and they say, "We are legion, for we are many." But now Jesus knows who he's dealing with. So he calls the demons out, but the demons plead not to be tortured in return, which is a very bold and ironic statement from them. So Jesus actually allows the demons to go into this herd of 2,000 pigs up on a hill nearby, and the pigs then subsequently run themselves off of a cliff and into the sea. It's a wild sight, a totally incredible story, but this man is healed and the demons leave. And the man is restored. But here's what I really want to draw our attention to. Jesus left the crowded place not only to get away, but to go to the one on the fringes. The one who was called outsider, the one isolated and alone, the one who needed to be seen and needed healing. Like, the crowds occupy our minds and our energies in ways that distract us from honestly seeing what and who Jesus wants us to see. We can be so caught up in the busyness of life, the gravitas, the algorithmically curated spaces that end up blinding us in ways that we don't often realize. The crowded spaces we gravitate toward are often about our own sense of belonging and wanting to be part of the group. But I think Jesus is showing us in this story that not only is it necessary for us to not be so caught up in crowded, frenzied places, but really to pay attention to the fact that these same spaces keep us out and blind from the proximity of those who are in need. I think that's the challenge and the call from Jesus here. Like, what needs to look different in our own spaces then? In our own pace of life? Are we looking to the margins? When I was 16 years old, I was at a party with some friends, and they knew I was a Christian, and some guy found that out, whatever. And this kid comes up to me who I don't know, and he says, "Hey, do you think that people who commit suicide go to hell?" A gigantic question for a 16-year-old, right? But he then confessed he was struggling with thoughts of suicide. And so I stopped and we talked and we chatted, and I don't remember what I said, and he wasn't, maybe healed from the deep wounds he had, and I hope he got more professional help than a 16-year-old. But in that moment, he reached out and I stopped and we talked, and he was just sitting there, had been ruminating on these terrible thoughts and feeling all alone in this party, in this giant crowded place. But we just talked, and I didn't want him to feel alone or leave that party thinking it would be a good idea to take his own life. Of course, not all conversations on the fringes will be this heavy, but I think it was a good reminder of the places that Jesus is drawing us to help pay attention to who is there and be present with love and listening and hope, and to walk with a life that's practicing this every day, seeing people, bringing dignity, seeing others as children of God. It's so easy to be in our crowded places and be accidentally ignorant of what's going on around us, because these crowded places are distracting and they demand from us, right? Without even asking for it, they demand our energy and our attention, and then they take our focus, and then we can't see who's on the outside and who's left out. And if we're honest, the crowds, like we talked about before, like give us the sense of belonging. And when we feel like we belong, we want to hang on to that. And we don't want to be the ones on the outside. So we stay in the crowd, and we do as the crowd does, as the busyness goes. And we give ourselves permission to continue to return to these crazy spaces on social media and wherever else, and news outlets, and just feel like we belong, or that we're heard. And Jesus is challenging our own comfort. Jesus is challenging us to step outside of that, right? Like to wake up and go, what spaces have I found myself in? And he calls us away, not only to just like pull us out and rescue us from crowded places or unhealthy spaces, but to get away and to actually see who's here, see who's out there, who needs help, who needs to be heard, who needs to be loved. Like, these are people in our community. They're our neighbors, our next door neighbors sometimes. This is for some of us, this is our family members, right? Who feel pushed out, who know that they are on the fringes. This is the invitation of following Christ, right? It's not just for our own personal feel-goods. It's for the sake of others. This is what it means to follow Jesus. So I'm hopeful and I'm prayerful that as Christ followers, we'll take this seriously, right? That we can acknowledge the places that have been distracting, the crowded places that have been demanding of us. Be courageous enough to step outside of them and to see. From that moment with that kid at the party when I was 16 years old, and that moment for me was pivotal. Because what came from that was a new prayer that I've prayed for the rest of my life. And it's a very simple one, and it says, Jesus, help me to see who you see. Help me to have your eyes, your vision, your ears, your heart. And I know that I'm going to want to be like in the crowd and feel like I belong, but give me your eyes, your ears, your heart, to see who's left out. I pray that that's our collective prayer as a church, as a faith community, as Christ followers, wherever you may be, to have the eyes and the heart and the ears and the mind of Christ to see, to reach out, to love well. Amen.
At 29 and I find myself wondering what did happen to the last 10. I ran away with my life, fast forward.